Hola a todos y bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio de Conversando en Libertad por Palabra Pública, en colaboración con High Labs, revista Individuo y Econintech. Estamos muy contentos de verlos el día de hoy junto con un gran invitado, pero primero queremos recordarles que se suscriban al canal, den like a este video y activen la campana para así estén al tanto de nuestros futuros programas, donde por ejemplo estaremos conversando de cultura con Cristian Rodrigo Iturrialde de Argentina, economía y ciencia política con nuestros amigos Michael Munger y Benjamin Powell, y filosofía complementando lo de Cristian junto al querido profesor Stephen Hicks. Para el día de hoy, contamos con un tremendo invitado desde Suecia. Él es autor, profesor y productor cinematográfico, Senior Fellow del Cato Institute en Estados Unidos y el Centro Europeo para la Política Económica Internacional en Bruselas. También ha recibido su maestría sobre la historia de las ideas en la Universidad de Estocolmo. Ha escrito en una tremenda diversidad de temas, incluyendo economía global y ciencia popular, siendo su libro Progreso, 10 razones para mirar hacia el futuro con optimismo, el cual fue denominado como un balde de agua fría de buen sentido común por The Economist y otros medios, y también el libro del año, creo, del año 2016 por The Economist, The Observer y The Guardian. Con nosotros, Johan Norberg. Dear Johan, thank you so much for being with us today. We are very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Well, after reading your work about the history of human progress, hold on a second, I have it right here. I think we're just going to put it on the side, but just for people to know about the title of the book. Great stuff, definitely. I recommend it for everyone to read. It's a must read. And as I was thinking about this conversation yesterday, I would like to start with a simple question for you that might not come with a simple answer. This being, what is it that inspired you to write about openness?
That's a great question. The reason why I wrote about openness is that I fear for its future and that I fear for a more closed world in various ways. The way we try to shut our minds and our discord to other opposing ideas. There's this tendency to block borders to other people and goods and services from other places and be more self-sufficient, and generally an attempt to basically have a more predictable, controlled environment. And I think that's detrimental to any kind of progress, which is dependent on surprises and innovation from various places. And then obviously, while I wrote that book on openness, we had the great pandemic and the world shut down faster than ever before. And it was a disaster in many ways, not just the virus in itself, but also the way in which it shut down workplaces, school, trade, and we saw an increase in poverty and hunger around the world. So that kind of proved the point that we desperately need openness.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. We're going to be talking a little bit about that in a bit, but also tolerance and human progress, which has actually received definitely a hit with COVID and all this, let's say, by less authoritarian, I was going to say totalitarian, but of course authoritarian government measures that have affected us all. But usually one tends to take things, or the things that we have, for example, whatever commodities maybe be nowadays, for granted. Meaning, of course, not necessarily fancy stuff. I mean, let's say things, just simple amenities such as a light bulb or a fridge or even air conditioning. I always enjoy talking a little bit about the history of human progress. And since we have a wonderful guest today, I would first like to address a statement. So more than 130,000 people have been approximately liberated from poverty every single day. And listen to this, for the past 25 years. 25 years, these are roughly speaking more than 1 billion people. That's crazy. This is great news, absolutely. But things were not like these in the past, and we have become used to wealth, averagely speaking, of course. In this sense, How was the world before us? So what was it like to our ancestors, let's say 200 or 500 years ago?
Yes, that's incredibly important to remind ourselves of that, because all this progress and all those indicators of everything from life expectancy to and child mortality to extreme poverty, they do not improve automatically. It's not that it just happens. We take it for granted because it's the world we happen to be born into, but it's all dependent on certain institutions and on certain political decisions and the openness that it entails. Because it's brand new in human history. 200 years ago, nobody on the planet had the kind of life that we lead today, not even the kings and the emperors. The average person who was born 200 years ago, even in the richest parts of the world, the average person lived in extreme poverty. The poverty measurement back then was basically being able to sustain yourself, to live to die another day. We had life expectancy around the world around 30 years. So if you are more than 30 years or hope to become more older than 30 years, you should be grateful for the kind of advances in science, technology, and the economy that we've seen over the last 200 years. And it's not just for the average person. I mean, the French king in Versailles in the 17th century, the most powerful person on the planet. And yet what people said when they approached the castle was, it stinks. Because, you know, he didn't have a water toilet. He had no way of getting the excrement out of the castle. So, and obviously no penicillin or antibiotics or any kind of surgery if he fell ill. So it's all brand new. Don't take it for granted because it comes somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Francisco, just before you get in, I just wanted to ask Professor Norberg if you could be a little bit more into details about um, the sort of life that the monarchy would upheld, I'm sorry, because you know that usually we hear this strawman argument or these thoughts about the zero-sum game about the economy. And so since back in the day, pretty much the 98 or 99% of the world population would have lived in extreme poverty, that fringe minority was not doing, let's say, much better than the rest.
Yeah, that's the most important thing to realize. It was not that we were so desperately poor, most of us or our ancestors, because a little tiny group had everything. Even if we had redistributed all the resources that were available 200 years ago on the planet, the average person would be poorer than the average person in sub-Saharan Africa is today. So everything that happened since then is because of an increase in wealth in all regions. So I mean, yeah, it happened quicker in Europe and the US. Roughly GDP per capita is now around 7 times higher than it was 100 years ago, but Latin America 6 times higher, Asia's 8 times higher, and even Africa's GDP per capita is 4 times higher than it was 100 years ago. So it was all about creating new resources, better ways of producing the things that we need. You could be Napoleon, you could be the French emperor or the Russian Tsar, and yet you wouldn't have access to dentistry or healthcare. You wouldn't have access to modern transportation. You would have to go by a horse, and no faster than a horse and a carriage. You wouldn't have access to communications technologies, access to information. You could get all the best priests and writers at your place, or all the best musicians over there, and yet it doesn't compare to what we have nowadays with the World Wide Web, where we can get any symphony orchestra online immediately in our own living room at a very low price. So it's all down to innovation and growth.
Absolutely, about the World Wide Web. if I said it correctly. I still remember economist Paul Krugman saying that, of course, the internet was not going to be a huge impact in our, let's say, chain of production, but that's something else. Francisco, you're on now.
Yeah, it would shock me the idea that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, he died 35 years old, and nobody knows exactly where his body is. They were like put in a grave when they put everybody. He was a genius of the time, and he innovated music. He made this sentimental, put it into music. He innovated. Today we have a lot of people that are not even close to genius, and they have incredible more opportunities than Mozart. And we thought that people in the past were better off, or they have this Jean-Jacques Rousseau idea that we were better with more close to nature. But today we are okay. Average people, even people that is not as innovator as Mozart, have incredible more advantage. So that's just incredible to think. But I want to move forward to our next topic.
Can I just say something about that?
Of course.
Mozart, who happens to be probably the greatest composer of all time, perhaps with the exception of Beethoven, he died at that age. It seems like researchers have now concluded that the reason why he died so young was nothing dramatic, nothing shocking. He had a sore throat. So he had a bacterial infection, and probably the doctors came to his place and said, yeah, you have a small bacteria there, so you might die. That's how you died, even if you were the greatest composer or a great emperor back then. So yeah, we should be happy to be alive today.
We should actually really happy. So we find in your research the idea that humans shape trade and trade shape humans. That idea is fascinating, but at the same time, I believe that trade is the means for a natural end of a chain of events that had its starting point in our ancestors' brain. In other words, implicitly, we trade ideas in the sense of keeping the best by applying the process of imitation. For instance, the idea that I have something you want and you have something I want. So if we exchange, we are all better off in this open exchange. So I'd like to ask you about our ancestors and how they realized that by cooperating, they would be better off, and how cooperation and cultural evolution are related.
Yes, this I happen to think is the most important insight into why it is that Homo sapiens of all species managed to conquer the planet. Because it wasn't, if an alien had watched planet Earth a couple of 100,000 or years ago, I don't think he would have bet on Homo sapiens, because we're actually quite weak. We're not that fast. We can't even fly. We're not that good at swimming. We don't have strong jaws or claws or anything like that. But we do have something else. We have one another. We're able to cooperate and trade. That really made the difference. And in my reading of history, this started a very long time ago. It started some 3 million years ago on the East African savanna, because back then, because of climate change, suddenly, we didn't leave the trees. The trees left us, they disappeared, and we had open savanna. And humans, or our ancestors, they were chimp-like creatures. They were probably very unprotected and were an easy prey for lions and saber-toothed tigers and hyenas. So they were probably killed, most of them, apart from a few who came up with an amazing discovery that changed world history forever. They began to throw stones at the predators, and they throw. If you do that all by yourself, it doesn't help much. But if you cooperate with the other chimp-like creatures and stand surrounding the lion, you can throw stones at it and cut it into pieces. And this is probably the start of cooperation and trade, because it meant that those of our ancestors who survived were the ones who were most cooperative, those who could communicate the best, those who could predict what the others were up to, those who developed a larger brain that kept track of all the social relationships, who will stand by my side if we're attacked and who will be a free rider, for example. So it started to benefit an evolutionary path where we got more cooperation, more exchange, and more abstract intelligence and ability to communicate. And this then led us to share other things, exchange favors, ideas, goods and services, so that we specialize. Those who hunt the best, they hunt. Those who gather, they gather. Those who can make tools do that. Those who can take care of the kids do that. So we had a lot of trade very early on before we were Homo sapiens at all. And what sets this apart, there's some very rudimentary trade in nature as well. But what makes this really different is that it creates not just a biological evolution, but a cultural evolution, because then we can start to learn from one another. If wolves come up with a better way to hunt, we have to wait several generations before those who hunt worse they die, and those who are successful, they procreate. Whereas in human beings, it's enough to look at them and notice that someone has come up with a better way to hunt, and we can learn from that. Well, that makes all the difference, because then if you have a sufficiently large population, someone is bound to stumble onto a better way of controlling fire, building a shelter, making clothes, or producing an mRNA vaccine, or developing the World Wide Web or a spaceship. So there's strength in numbers, as long as you're open and you constantly have trade and exchange with others.
Mhm. And it's interesting that you made this clear point in your research about that. For example, animals, they have they depend a lot on genetics and evolution, like Darwinian evolution. But humans, by imitation, this saying cultural evolution, can go forward super fast. So you say that uh, cultural evolution is quite faster than genetic evolution, and that made the whole difference.
Yeah,
So
then it happens instantly. We just look at what others do and we imitate them. And we're so far quick at doing this that it almost happens subconsciously. We can't help but pick up new language, even bad language from our surroundings, and new ideas. And what this also makes possible is combinations, new strange combinations between what we see and what we had already thought of, or our particular perspective. And that's incredibly important, something that is much more difficult to do with genetic biological evolution. You can suddenly think of, if I combine that way of moving something with this particular thing I want to move, could be train and rails, or it could be a bag and wheels, so that we don't have to carry the bags. Whatever, we can make up new experiments. We can have our imagination at full speed and combine different perspectives. And that's really what I think creativity is about, having a particular experience field by which we look at the world, and then we combine it in strange new ways.
of course, of course. You said that Hayek saying that the advancement and even the preservation of civilization are dependent upon a maximum of opportunities for accidents to happen. So what is the role of accidents and spontaneous order in our journey as individuals and society in the seeking of betterment?
Yeah, this is one of the most counterintuitive lessons of either studying world history or studying Hayek, preferably both. It is that when you look at, say, technology history, but it's cultural history as well, whatever we have and that we appreciate today, it could be the personal computer, or it could be the vaccine, or it could be the shirt that I'm wearing. it wasn't predicted. It wasn't created by a committee. It wasn't created by a spark of genius by a single individual. It was created by strange circumstances, often serendipity, where someone came up with something and somebody else found a way to improve upon that with their own perspective on things. And then incremental improvements and trial and error, lots of error and feedback from users, audiences and markets, and then feedback so that you change and adapt what you're doing. And it's completely unpredictable because there's no brain is as big as to predict what is going to happen. It's dependent on these chance meetings and these experiments, constant experiments based on local knowledge and local individual ideas about what can be done over there. And no one has such a high position as to be able to look at all of that and see how it all fits together. It is dependent on those local surprises, often accidents and often stumbling onto a new idea. And that's why we need, as Hayek put it, freedom is actually most important when we don't know what it is going to result in, because that's precisely where we need progress. And that's why we need to unleash millions of people who experiment from their own local situation, and someone or a few of them are bound to stumble onto something great.
Wow, that's great. Ignacio.
Yeah, that's right. Freedom, the spontaneous order, and cooperation, which it actually leads up to our next topic. And I would like to turn into a spicy one. And of course, I would like to keep it as far away from politics as possible. We could somewhat say that we're currently living a process of involution in which political polarization has drained the best of us. Of course, not meaning that people are not holding their best intentions as well as their interests at heart, because they are. Well, we all want the best for our families and friends, and also the poor, of course, unless we happen to be psychopaths. But those are only a fringe minority, as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would say, of course. I remember how well documented this actually was by Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind. We always ought to be right. And as you previously mentioned, we do have tribal origins. And while debating ideas, it is also true that it does not help to stay close to our confirmation bias. In this sense, I would like to quote, and correct me if I said it wrong, Nicholas Hartstocker. And I say, quote, he said, sorry, of course, I very humbly beg for all of those, or for all whose opinions I have attacked, perhaps with too much liberty, not to take it in a bad way, since I have most often done this only to invite them to do the same to mine. This philosophical war will likely cost a bit of ink, but there will be no spilling of blood, end quote. It is common to see people around canceling everyone just because they're not woke, or because they're just not holding the same political views. So if you don't go with the mainstream narrative, it happens that you carry heresy with you. This is one thing, but I would like to link it to when you talk about open minds and open societies, which it was brilliantly written. So in this sense, how does restraining freedom of speech and clashing ideas with one another in open debate affects progress and the pursuit of truth?
Yeah, I think this is the reason why we live in the modern world. We wouldn't have had the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and liberal democracy without free and often obnoxious and fairly brutal speech, where people attacked one another, as we just heard in that great quote that you quoted. Because this is really what happened in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. For the first time, for a longer sustainable period of time, did people from different backgrounds and different sciences and different religions and political leanings begin to exchange ideas in a peaceful setting. They were often not allowed to do that because there was censorship in most countries. But since Europe was so fragmented, there was often openness. It was difficult to synchronize and coordinate oppression all over the continent. So what was banned in Italy was accepted in the Netherlands, and what was banned in the Netherlands was accepted in France, and so on. So you could, dissenters always had some way to end up. And then we also got this republic of letters, whereby philosophers and writers and scientists, they began to exchange letters through the new postal system and compare notes and exchange ideas and crazy ideas, and began to challenge one another and build upon one another's insights. And this created the creative critical mass for the Enlightenment, and made possible then the Industrial Enlightenment and the advances in sciences, without which we wouldn't have had these 200 years of incredibly rapid growth compared to everything that came before it. And the reason why free speech functions in this way is, again, our limited knowledge. No one has insights and knowledge about everything. If we want more knowledge, we have to allow more people to go out and look for it. And then we will only benefit from what they are seeing if we are listening to them. And that's why it's so incredibly important with opponents, to have people whom you disagree with in most different ways, because we all have confirmation bias. I have confirmation bias. We go through the world all the time. Every time we speak to someone or read a book, we have this package of ideas that we are protecting consciously or subconsciously, and trying to make sure that everything fits with that package of ideas. And that often makes sense, and we should be loyal to our ideas and not throw everything out immediately. But we also have to be conscious about the fact that we aren't all wise, all knowing. We need to learn more and get the perspective of others. And the most important allies that we have is counterintuitively our most vicious opponents, because they have a completely different package of ideas, which means that they pick up the other bits and pieces of information about the world that we neglect because we think it hurts our package. So this is difficult for everybody, of course, but to me, the most important thing that I can do to learn more constantly and to understand the world in a better way is to read my opponents and talk to them all the time. Because even if I dislike what they say, even if they have vicious ideas, far right or far left ideas, they have seen things that I've tried to neglect. And therefore, if I listen to them and their challenges to my position, well, I will learn new facts about the world that I would never have picked up myself. So if you go around and cancel everything that doesn't agree with your package, then I'm sorry, you'll be stuck with your package to your detriment, because you will be less wise because of it.
Right. And you know what? I was having a laugh when I went back to your notes in the end of your book, and you were actually speaking about confirmation bias and how many times you were predicting the bust of the bubble, like back there in Sweden. And then you were just like, you know what? I don't even trust my own judgment anymore. Yeah, but sometimes we seldom actually hear about the Spanish Inquisition. But in history, this has not been documented only in that era. It has also happened in different times, and empires have censored and, of course, killed the ones who have held unique ideas in Asia, the Middle East, and basically everywhere. So could you talk a little bit to us more about how this process of involution has repeated itself over and over again, and recently as being woke?
Yeah, there is this law in history called Cardwell's law, which is really depressing. And I hope it's not a natural law, but at least it's a pattern that keeps repeating itself. It's named after a historian of technology and culture, and it was phrased by Joel Moker, the economist and historian. And what it says is that in lots of places around the world throughout history, we've had golden ages of rapid improvement, of scientific discovery, technological innovation, and of economic growth. We've had this in ancient Greece, in the Roman Empire, in the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate, in Song China, and in the Italian Renaissance. But Cardwell's law says it's only a spark, a brief spark of progress, because eventually all the powers that be, the church, the old economic establishment and the political establishment and the emperor, they feel threatened by these experiments and by this innovation, because their power is usually based on a certain way of doing things. And when those things are being changed and we get new power centers and more decentralized power, it ruffles feathers and it really upsets the established order. And therefore they fight back and they try to kill off this dissent, this innovation. They can do it in different ways. Often it's an inquisition and they burn the books and they imprison or kill the dissenters and innovators and philosophers. Or it could be just strangling regulation and monopolies that make sure that you're not allowed to innovate in a strange new way. We saw that whenever these forces of innovation became too powerful in a way and began to upset those who had the ideological hegemony in societies. So in the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate, for example, we had very rational early Renaissance ideas, often borrowed from Greek philosophers and Aristotle and so on. And they began to make discoveries in natural sciences, and that was still popular. But then after a while, they began to challenge religion, and then they fought back. The same thing in China. We had an early Renaissance 1,000 years ago. Even there, we had an improvement of individualism and of free markets, and that was fine for a while until society, and especially then the intellectual establishment, began to be fearful that their position was being challenged. And we got the Ming dynasty, who consciously defined itself as we are the stable force that will make, well, sort of China great again by returning to something we had before all of this chaotic innovation and progress. And they began to ban international trade and ban dissenters and new thoughts and the great encyclopedias that were being written there. So unfortunately, that tendency is there everywhere. And I don't think that we in our present civilization are any exception to this. The moment that innovation is challenging the powers that be, we'll get the fight back here as well. It could be new forms of media that challenges the traditional media establishment. And then obviously they try to fight back and demonize the new forces over there. New ideas are being presented and exchanged, and that threatens university establishments or the ideology that's popular among certain groups at campuses and so on. And they have to fight back. And if they can't do it in open debate, they try to shut the debate down. And that's, I think, one of the temptations of this cancel culture. It's really a way of trying to unleash this kind of stability, purity, make sure that our way of doing things is not disturbed.
Yeah, I'm deeply passionate about this topic, especially free speech, and trying to understand what it is, this new cult of political correctness. Yeah, but unfortunately, we need to move on. We still have two hot topics to talk about, and as much I would love to, I cannot delay it. Francisco, you're on.
Thank you. What I want to say is today the concept of open society is always an idea that used by those who struggle for social justice, globalism, and these sort of things, whatever that may mean. for Karl Popper, that expression defines a world where innovations and ideas happen more often, where he say, where quote, like, where we don't expect them, quote. That is the origin behind the concept of open society for Popper. In this type of society, the role of government must protect freedom and enforce a system where rules are applied equally to all citizens. That's the thing. In Chile, as you may know, some elected people are trying to write a new constitution, which supposedly would be widely representative. But with their fists are raised, but they try to they sound open-minded, globalist, pluralist, inclusive, and all these sort of things with unicorns and fairy tales. They use the word equally a lot. However, the same people that speak about open society, globalism, inclusiveness, the very same people are proposing a constitution where the law and the rules should be designed and applied differently according to the type of ethnicity you belong to. And we see those contradictions, and in an ever so slightly fashion, but almost in every session they have. So how could you explain this hypocrisy?
Yeah, this is a very strange phenomena, because when you look at the modern Western world, in liberal democracies that have had for a longer period of time a protection of individual rights and of relatively free markets, I would say that we have greater real equality between groups than we've ever had before. We've had and that's not based on any kind of group identity. It's based on the idea that the individual is the primary unit of society. And if individuals are given equal rights and the rule of law and protection for their individual rights, then that's the way to get away from all this group hatred and all the discrimination that we've had historically, because then everybody is treated by the law in the same way, regardless of which group that they belong to. Now, there are those groups, often progressive elements, who say that this is not enough because we haven't seen exactly the same outcomes and the same kind of lives or incomes or careers for all different various groups around society. But that's obvious, and in a way this is another side of the other side of the same coin. If people all have the same rights, we will make different decisions in our lives, and we will end up in different places with different careers and incomes as well, and that is not necessarily discrimination. And I'm not saying that there's no discrimination or racism or anything like that in our society. Obviously, there still is, but this is the best way to get away from it. Now, when those progressive groups begin to talk about different groups and they should have group rights and they should be defined by the law, it's really a way of getting away from equality for the law. And it is because they want people to end up in the same places. And this is an incredibly dangerous way to go about things, because this is always how group warfare starts. Because then it means you have to belong to a particular group. You have to belong to a strong group, and you have to fight for your group rather than for equal protection for everybody and individual rights for everybody. This is often how we get the worst aspects of modern history, because then people will begin to feel like they've been mistreated because they do not belong to that particular group that is being benefited by certain political conditions right now, and they will start to fight back, and that quickly gets ugly. So don't open up that can of worms, because it's very difficult to get it shut again.
What it paid my attention is today is not just you have to belong, you have to be from certain ethnicity or have certain physical quality, but also it comes with certain ideas. Basically, there's this concept that okay, you belong to this ethnicity, so you should think that way, and it's kind of label people. I don't know. It's very like constraints people ability to progress by themselves. They are defined by others, by a body of thoughts they don't even sometimes know closely. So yeah, this is a very important and interesting topic, but we need to go forward. So Ignacio.
Yeah, immigration.
Wow.
I know this is also hot politically speaking, especially in Chile, since the country is suffering the biggest immigration crisis in its history. However, let's try to avoid any bias and let's try to find truth within this topic. I believe our audience will appreciate it. Um, I would like to provide some context first. So, for the past couple of years, let's kindly say that deficient immigration policies, as well as international issues such as the totalitarian tyranny that our fellow Venezuelans are currently experiencing, has made it mandatory for millions of people to emigrate into Chile in order to survive. Within this, we've seen a spike in the rates of crime, poverty, unemployment, and the decrease in the real wages. Just to mention a few, one, because of course the market mechanism, the other because of populist public policies that push the devaluation of the currency. Said simple, inflation, and many other issues, social unrest, especially in the northern borders. um, this unrest has been unleashed since a truck driver was killed by illegal immigrants, leading our Chilean version of the Canadian Freedom Convoy. I know this sounds rough, but let's first talk about immigration. So, data suggests that immigration is and it has always been something positive for societies and their development. Unlike some people might believe in this regard, this is something we spoke about with Professor Powell from Texas Tech. Usually, one hears people afraid of immigrants and how it may or may not affect their jobs, culture, and the country overall. So, in this regard, what does history suggest about immigration, and what has been the role of tolerance? How important word within the spontaneous order and the open society?
Yes, I think it's important to look at history and at history's great societies, why they created rapid progress. Well, one reason was that they were relatively open to migrants from other places. And this is for one simple, very simple reason. If you want access to as much ideas and a larger pool of talent and of more production and more creativity, well, the more people you have to choose from, the better off you are. That's just a simple mathematical argument. The Roman Empire could build stronger armies and even a stronger Senate and some fairly competent emperors, because they picked and choose from the whole empire and had foreigners even as emperors. And that's something that we see in history's golden ages. Those who have been successful are the ones who picked from a larger pool of talent. And we can see it in a simple way with just our economy, the fact that if people move across borders, well, they can then apply their ideas and their work to our economy. And if they come from poorer countries, they can quickly improve their productivity and their income just by being close to modern technology and larger markets. There are economic studies saying that if we abolished all the barriers to people to move to wherever they want to go, where their job is being paid the most, we would double the size of the world economy quite rapidly. So it is of great benefit to a society to be open to more people. Now, that doesn't mean that migration always works, and it doesn't mean that people always will accept it, especially if it happens quickly and we see a large inflow of people who seem very different and there are culture clashes over there. We shouldn't, those very real problems can be real practical problems. And that doesn't contradict the fact that we need migration. I mean, books is one of the most useful and important things there is. But if I get 1,000 books falling onto my head right now, that's probably a bad thing. So obviously we have to think about how do we make sure that books or migrants appear in an orderly fashion, and that it doesn't upset and create counter reactions that would result in less migration in the future.
Yeah, of course. Culture is one thing. I remember I was listening to Professor Friedman's conference one day. He was brightly and briefly explaining how the US benefited from its open borders and its open society and just economic freedom 200 or 100 years ago, and how, as you have just mentioned, things have changed since, not necessarily because of immigration per se, but because of politics and public policies that actually lead to the welfare state and what we would call, let's say, unfair actions. But let's say now that what is an imperative to be understood, after understanding the economics of immigration in a simple matter, and of course, if people want to dive a little bit more into this, you can visit our other videos and conversations about this same topic with Benjamin Powell, and we will be talking about the economics of immigration with Brian Kaplan, as I understand. But let's speak more about rhetoric and politics. So in Chile, for example, people are worried about the public system collapsing, or in economic terms, to become even more socially inefficient than it already is. With social unrest, these hyenas start to show up, of course, meaning the politicians. So I would like, if you could, coming to the end of this conversation, clarify what is the role of a well-designed public policy, or at least to keep interventionism as far away as possible. Because roughly speaking, we will find ourselves with two types of nasty politicians. On one side, they're the ones that will claim that all are welcome and all immigrants are entitled to the welfare system, no matter if they come in legally or not. And on the other hand, the nationalist protectionists that will try to increase their popularity by targeting and demonizing immigrants as if they were the problem and not politicians, were the source of the most social issues. So why is that politicians tend to turn humanity against its own engine? So that's a question.
Well, the problem is that politicians often get elected because they pick sides and they start this tension between groups by saying that, look, I defend you in this group and you are threatened by these other groups. But elect me, give me lots of powers, and I'll try to pick their pockets and hand over to you, and I'll try to do what I can to give you all the privileges there are. And then you just pick sides. It could be sort of, I represent the working classes, or I represent these ethnic minorities, or I represent the normal traditional lists in our nation, and so on. And unfortunately, that's often how you build a power base. The problem is that this is not how you create a decent, growing, dynamic society. You do that by making sure that it's not about groups, it's about individuals and protecting their rights and liberties to go about their business in the ways that they see fit according to their local knowledge and individual needs. If you do that, you will create more growth, you will create more opportunities for more people. And that's better for everybody in the long term, but it might not always get you elected. And that's the problem. Now, what we see with the migration issue is precisely this kind of contrast. It seems like both the left and the right, they agree that immigrants are a burden. And then the left thinks, yeah, we should take from all the privileged people and give to to the migrants and the generous welfare services and other stuff, it's going to be costly. Whereas the other side says, yes, we agree. That's exactly the way it is. It's very costly, and we won't agree that, so we won't let any migrants in. Well, the history of migration is that these are often the most entrepreneurial people who are most willing to adapt to circumstances. Think about it yourself. Who of your friends would be willing to up their sticks and move to another country where you might not understand the local mores, sometimes not even the language, and have to start again anew? Well, it's probably not the ones who are the most lazy and traditionalist or anything like that. It's more entrepreneurial, adventurous individuals. So give them the chance to improve their own lives by their own ability, and then they'll create a better life for themselves and to others. And this, I think, is the challenge for politicians when it comes to all different subjects, all different spheres of society, to explain that it's not about different groups that I am going to benefit, because whatever I can do is very limited, except the harm that I can possibly do. The real power is out there in the population, in all the millions of people looking for better ways of doing things and better way to enrich themselves and society. And to explain both a more humble role for politics, that there isn't that much that I can predict and control from above, with this optimistic vision of what can be done if people are being given at least a tiny bit of freedom. Then they'll surprise everybody, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Plus concepts to keep up, as you just said. So personal responsibility, humbleness by the part of the politicians, and actually openness. That's it. Francisco, any last comments before closing up?
Yeah, very, very short. Is interesting that how important it is for innovation and for progress, human progress, actually getting close to people, to know new people with new ideas, with new perspective, and that could easily speed up our progress. That's an important issue. Is not oftenly speak loud in politics. We always see immigrations from, I don't know, vicious perspective rather than the benefit it brings to us. And I think that's the real, for me, meaning of this word diversity. Diversity for me means like the fact that you can meet diverse aspect of life. That's it, and that will help you in many ways. Sometimes we don't expect to find. So it's been a wonderful conversation, Professor, and I'm so glad to spend this time with you. So happy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been definitely a pleasure. But as Francisco and I just recalled, unfortunately, and due to your time, we're reaching the end of our conversation. It is sometimes unmotivating since there is so much to talk about. Yeah. But we want to thank you so much for sharing some time with us and our audience, Johan. And of course, we would love to have you back with us another time in the future if possible.
Sure, let's do that. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.